glaucoma. You tick off a series of boxes and write in a comment or two, giving a succinct history about what you and your family have been through, what your ancestors have survived, because that history shapes your treatment. You don't ignore diseases and ailments that run in your family unless you want to stay sick. No, instead you confront those things. You face them head on. You tell everyone who's willing to listen to you about that past. And I think it's the same when it comes to this country, when it comes to race, when it comes to ourselves, when it comes to our communities. We have to reckon with our past. We have to confront our history. The reality is that we cannot escape it. We cannot ignore it, not without risking tremendous peril. And the truth is that if we don't deal with our past, we will continue to relive it over and over and over again. Our past is with us always, and a refusal to grapple with it dooms us to reliving it. So with that fundamental point in mind, I think it's important just to take a step back and look at what our past is. What is our ancestral inheritance as people living in this country? And the sad truth is that past is rooted in genocide and enslavement. Yes, there's a lot more than just those two phenomena, and centuries have passed since our nation's founding. But if we're really being honest with ourselves, these are the roots of our nation's family tree. These are the congenital diseases that we'd have to check off on a family medical history. They're the brick and mortar that have built this house that seems so hotly divided. When America's founding fathers set their sights on what they called the New World, they saw a land that was rich with promise and opportunity and would allow them to establish a new nation. They ignored the fact that there were people who were already here, who didn't have alabaster skin, who spoke a foreign tongue, who observed different customs and a different way of life. They wiped those native people out like trees. And they imported a workforce in shackles and chains to build that new nation for them. Now, let's be clear, up until that point, race was not a popular or central concept. It didn't exist. It was made up, completely invented, and depended upon stigmatizing people with brown skin as inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep them at the bottom rung of society, to treat them as property, to prevent them from learning to read, to write, to extract labor from their bodies, to take their children from them, to leave them yearning to be free. In white skin, the white body, that was the standard against which all else was judged. All of the worst, most pernicious stereotypes you can think of are born out of this time, at the very birth of our nation. The idea that Black people were so lazy they had to be brutalized into working, that they were so stupid and reckless that they had to be controlled, that they were so dangerous that they had to be surveilled and monitored and kept in line. These ugly racist ideas have left their thumbprint on the American brain. And so with roots centuries deep, injustice is bound up in our nation's history and the various systems that each one of us works in and day out. And when people tell you that these systems are broken, I want you to reject that very fundamental premise. When I was a public defender, I watched my clients being sentenced to years and years and years in prison and spending decades on death row, having their lives and their families' lives destroyed by injustice. When all that mitigated punishment or explained how they arrived before the court in the custody of the state was ignored, I couldn't help but think that the systems that we were talking about were operating exactly as they were designed. They were designed to control people, to marginalize people, to perpetuate the caste system that was built at the core of this country. It's evidenced by every single structure in place in this country today. Black life was and continues to be defined by the law. And in America, the law, and the criminal law in particular, is a tool of racial control. That makes it our duty as people living in this country who care about justice, who care about equality, to understand and disrupt the inherent racism of the system. Now, in order to do that, you have to understand and know that racism is dynamic. It's a shapeshifter. The ideology of white supremacy has evolved time and time and time again and will by default perpetuate domination and subjugation. You have to know too that the law has been part of that evolution. Over and over again, we have seen prejudice codified as precedent. You have to recognize that without radical change, without a fundamental undoing of the way that we think and live, injustice will continue to resurge. To quote the scholar Derek Bell, he was of the view that Black people will never gain full equality in this country. That even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. Now, undoubtedly, that's a very tough pill to swallow, and it pains me to say it. But it's a fact that's borne out by history. We've lived through a history of progress and retrenchment. And when you look back at that history, you see it as clear as day. Anywhere between 12 and 15 million people were sold into enslavement. That's the entire population of the state of New York. That's all of Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi combined. Over 2 million people died on the journey. That's the entire jail and prison population. At one point, the South produced 75% of the world's cotton. Everyone benefited. And I mean everyone. If it wasn't benefiting from free labor, it was financial, literally insuring Black bodies as property. Banks getting rich off of this racial caste system of enslavement. The ideology of enslavement was so deeply embedded in our society that mortgages were secured with people who were treated as property. We had an entire financial infrastructure that was built on ensuring slave owners against the loss of their property. We often talk about our nation's racist regime as though it took hold only in the South, and that's, as you all know, a mistake. Just to demonstrate how widespread that racist regime was, at one point, the city of New York, where I live and work now, ranked only second to Charleston, South Carolina, in the United States cities that held the most people in enslaved captivity. In the early 1700s, nearly half of New York's households had enslaved people, more than Philadelphia and Boston combined. Rikers Island, which is a penal colony here in New York City, is named after a magistrate, Richard Riker, who was the owner of that island in the early 1800s. His ancestors purchased that land in the 17th century. The historian Eric Foner found that in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act, pro-slavery officials and slave traders would bring a Black person before Richard Riker, who would quickly issue a certificate of removal before the accused had a chance to bring witnesses to testify that they were actually free. Riker would speed up this process to capture Black people who'd fled the South, and then would collect kickbacks from bounty hunters for each enslaved person he helped send back into slavery. These were people who shouldn't have been enslaved in the first place, and some of whom were free for their entire lives. In 1711, there was a slave market that was established right at the foot of Wall Street, where Wall Street sits today. It was a market that was intended for hiring and buying and selling enslaved people. That market wasn't dismantled until the middle of the 18th century. So my own city profited enormously from enslavement. So much so that leading up to the Civil War, the mayor of New York City originally proposed seceding rather than losing profits from the cotton trade that New York was engaged with in the South. But that history was peppered with struggle, with small acts of revolution, with calls for abolition that eventually prevailed. We fought our nation's bloodiest war to end that vile institution. And in that moment, we confronted our past. We challenged it, and we moved forward. And then we saw a backlash. That brutality didn't end with enslavement. No, instead, having been enslaved for 250 years, as Ta-Nehisi Coates tells us, Black people weren't just left to their own devices. They were terrorized. Across the deep South and across many parts of the country, a second slavery ruled. In the North, legislatures, mayors, civic associations, banks, citizens all colluded to pin Black people into ghettos, where they were overcrowded, overcharged, undereducated. Businesses discriminated against them, awarding them the very worst jobs and the lowest wages, if wages at all. Police brutalized them in the streets. And the notion that Black lives and Black bodies and Black wealth were rightful targets remained deeply rooted in the broader society. In the era of convict leasing, the racist ideas and attitudes of the past persisted and were reflected in very new practices. We emancipated Black people. We didn't actually give them or grant them freedom. Instead, we terrorized them. We accused them of crimes they didn't commit. We accused them of things that were not even crimes and imposed a system of slavery by another name altogether. Now, these next slides, I want to warn you, are graphic, but I think necessary for us to look at. Because we not only re-enslaved people, we lynched them, murdered them. There were more than 4,400 racial terror lynchings that we know of between Reconstruction and World War II. These lynchings were for everything from the mundane, scolding children and contesting payment for work rendered, to the imagined, assaults that never even happened, thefts that never took place, looking at a white person the wrong way or failing to address them with an honorific, sir or ma'am. And again, people fought. They struggled. They engaged in small acts of revolution. Calls for civility prevailed. Efforts to attain civil rights prevailed. We confronted our past, we challenged it, and we moved forward. But yet, that same ideology, the ideology of white supremacy, the politics of fear and anger, the presumption of criminality, of dangerousness, of dysfunction that attached to skin color, persisted. Those things, those ideas didn't just go away, they evolved. They wound their way into our city streets, in the schoolhouses as we erected Jim Crow segregation and redlining. They flowed through the water as it exited separate white and Black water fountains. They infiltrated transportation as everyday Americans rode the bus home. They morphed into wars on drugs and poverty. But people continued to struggle. People continued to fight back. People who continued to undertake small acts of revolution. We fought to establish equality under the law. We confronted that past, we challenged it, and once again moved forward. And yet, I keep coming back to this point about history, because that past clings with us. It casts a shadow over our present, and it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins, because it really does shape everything that we see and do in America. I want you to take a look at the pictures in this slide and tell me we are not reliving our past every day. The pictures in the upper right-hand corner, in the middle, and in the lower left-hand corner are taken from Louisiana State Penitentiary. It's a prison in Louisiana, about an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of New Orleans. And the prison grounds, I want to talk about this for a second. The prison grounds are the grounds of a plantation that was literally leased to a Confederate general at the end of the Civil War. And the prison itself has a nickname. It's called Angola. And the reason why it's called Angola is not because there's a city in Louisiana called Angola, but because the enslaved people who worked the land of that plantation were from the country of Angola in Africa. That's where the prison gets its name from. When you drive up through the prison gates, and I'd gone to visit a client who was on death row there, they take away all your electronics, all your modern technologies, your phones, your GPS, your maps, and you drive through the gates, and what you see as you're driving through the gates are Black men working the fields, chained together in some instances, in other instances, working off at a distance. You see men on horseback with guns watching over them. And it's as though you step back into the 1830s, 1840s. And on this particular visit, I drove farther and farther into the prison grounds and was shocked by what I had seen up until that point. And finally got to the building where my client was housed on death row. And went to sign in to visit with him. And after signing in, I go into the visiting room, sit down, my client is sitting across from me. There's a window behind him at his back. And I start to see people walking past that window. People not wearing prison guard uniforms or the uniforms of people who are in prison, but regular everyday folks, people who look like they were coming from the store or from a lunch. And I asked my client, what's going on here? Why are these people walking by? And start seeing kids and teenagers walking by and looking in and peering into the window. My client tells me, well, that's a tour. They actually take groups of people and tour them through death row, tour them through this prison as a reminder of, I guess, we're not deserving of any dignity or empathy, not deserving to be treated as human beings, but really are should be treated as animals, as people to be observed, as though we're living in a zoo. That mentality, that ideology, there's a straight line from that belief system, the ability to kind of walk past people on a tour and treat them as though they're animals, from that straight back to the very roots and foundation of this country. And so at this point, you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with me? And to put it bluntly and quite frankly, the answer is everything. But if you live in Milwaukee, you already knew that. And if you're part of Tosa Together, or you're part of the Milwaukee Turners, you already knew that as well. But for those of you who don't, I've talked about how we're made by our history, how we're created by our history, how our history shapes us and shapes our relationships with one another. Well, Milwaukee is like every other place in the United States. It's held captive by its history. That history has produced some staggering facts, some facts that you probably already are very well aware of, but I think it's worth remembering and reminding us of. The fact that Milwaukee is one of the most, if not the most, segregated metropolitan areas in the United States. A place that was long a cloister of white European immigrants, where Black people who were escaping the terror and violence of the South actually settled in Chicago, so they never made it to Milwaukee until the 1950s. This map that you see in the upper right-hand corner or upper left-hand corner of your screen, shows the extent to which the federal government and banks perpetuated the segregation that defines Milwaukee today. Literally denying loans to those who lived in areas marked in red. If you wonder where redlining comes from, this is a map. The red lines are exactly what that's talking about. Let me say that again. The Federal Housing Administration, a federal agency, for the better part of 35 years, guaranteed home loans to white people while refusing explicitly to do the same for Black people, marking off areas where Black people resided. Racially restrictive covenants, private agreements that prevented the sale of white homes to Black people did the rest of the work. The tools of segregation literally destroyed the possibility of investment wherever Black people and people of color lived. And what does segregation mean? Well, it means that Black communities have lower home values, lower levels of employment, lower levels of education, lower incomes than they otherwise would have if they were white. It means they have less access to healthcare, less access to a healthy and clean environment, less access to the types of resources and investments that allow a community to thrive. And yes, because of that, there's more crime, more interpersonal violence, more contact with the criminal legal system, more police, more prosecutions, more police violence, more police brutality. Poverty, isolation, the dilution of political power, all are products of segregation. All the result of that ideology at the core of America's original sin, literally built into the foundation of the city. And of course, the numbers speak for themselves. When we think about the fact that over half of Black men in their 30s and 40s have been incarcerated in Milwaukee County. When we think about the achievement gap between Black and white students in Milwaukee. When we think about the fact that 4 out of 5 Black children in Wisconsin are living in poverty, and 42% of those children are living in the city of Milwaukee. And of course, you all know too well the scourge of police violence that has long plagued Milwaukee. You already know the names: Joel Acevedo, Alvin Cole, Terry Williams, Adam Trammell, Seville Smith, Jay Anderson, Dontre Hamilton, Daniel Bell. Black people killed by the police for decades. I asked, what does this have to do with you? Well, we're in one of these moments right now where we have an opportunity to make some progress despite all the things I just described. If we know anything about history, we know that people fight back, push back, engage in these small acts of revolution, and push forward. And what I want you to do is think of yourselves as architects of democracy, as people who are responsible for creating the type of world that we want to live in, as people who have an opportunity to promote racial justice and break free of those cycles of peaks of progress that gets us to lasting change. So with all that in mind, the question becomes, what do we do about it? Well, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I think ordinarily our mind immediately jumps to tear down all these structures and institutions. And yes, there's definitely a place for that and a need for that and a deep desire for that. But I also want you to start by thinking about the difference in your own world, in your day-to-day life. Trying to tear down the system may feel impossible, but taking small steps, pushing step by step, you can actually be the difference in the world that you want to build. And the steps of doing so are pretty straightforward. First, it's a matter of educating yourself. You're engaged in that work right now just by listening to this conversation and engaging with this conversation. But it also means educating yourself about our nation's history, about the presumption of criminality that attaches to race, about the condemnation of Blackness that infects the ways in which police and the criminal legal system see Black and brown people. I also want you to know that this is a lifelong process. It requires continuous, thoughtful introspection. It requires checking yourself at every stage and every part of your life, no matter what race you are. Because I want to be clear that we're all infected with this smog of racial inequality, with this smog of racial injustice. So that means regardless of your race, asking yourself, where are you getting your news? Who are you reading? Who are you watching on TV? Is the media that you are consuming made by people who have lived experience with these systems of oppression, marginalization, and harm? Are the sources you're consuming making you look at the world differently than you currently do? Are they forcing you to question what you may have learned or may have missed out on while you were in school? Is it rooted in truth or propaganda or falsehood? On top of this kind of educational piece, I want you to think about your own identity and how that identity has shaped your life and life experiences and outcomes. How did your race shape the life that you've lived? If you think about the lives that we live, the reality is that we live very insular experiences. We are rarely ever challenged in our racial worldview. Part of it is because we live in separate communities and separate lives and separate places. We move through a society where racial inequality is a very bedrock of racial comfort. Most people in this country go cradle to grave in persistent racial segregation. And we live in that existence without seeing anything of value lost over time. We use the absence of Black people and other people of color as a value measure of our own space. What's a good neighborhood? What's a good school? We answer those questions in part by the absence of Black and brown people in those spaces. If you're understanding that, you have to get uncomfortable. What does getting uncomfortable look like? It may mean making a list about how you've dealt with racism to date and how you'd like that to change. You might start your list thinking about, well, I wasn't educated on racism. I don't talk about racism with the people in my life. I don't talk about racism with people of color. I don't really know any people of color. I haven't really cared to find out, but I want to do something about it. And that requires doing the work. You could try something like Eddie Moore, who's a psychologist, has this 21-day racial equity building challenge. And it's modeled on this adage that it takes 21 days to build or break a habit. He provides this kind of manageable and meaningful actions that prepare you to engage with race and inequality and the law. I want to encourage you to read things like Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. Menachem is a social worker, and he talks about racism as a trauma response, as something that is literally in our bodies and in our souls and passed down from generation to generation to generation. Something that we have to break free of. Read the book Caste, or The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, or The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, or The 1619 Project. As you're engaging with this educational effort, as you're thinking about your own identity and how it's shaped your own life, as you're doing this work and getting uncomfortable, I also want you to get proximate. Proximity is so very important because it helps to highlight the spaces where we need to take action. That means talking to the people in your life, the relative who always says that thing that you roll your eyes out at and just have to let go. It means sitting with your discomfort and confronting it. Because your silence in the face of racism is an endorsement, whether you agree with it or not. Beyond your friends and family and loved ones, to keep that same energy and attitude while you're at work and outside your home. Treat people well and with respect, and respect the perspectives of those who have lived different lives and have had different experiences from you. Recognize that there are phenomena that really foster implicit and explicit biases and trigger stereotypes that come to mind for everybody about who's of value, who deserves to be heard, who needs protection, and who needs to be controlled. Our history has primed us to make judgments about Black people and other people of color. We have to work constantly and be vigilant to upset those judgments. And as you're kind of undertaking that individual level work, I want you to keep on pushing. I want you to go from the individual and from defending one individual or standing up against a singular incident to think about groups and systems, to find ways to get involved in your own community and in your own space. There are countless volunteer opportunities. I know Tosa Talks, I know Milwaukee Turners are among just a couple, and Emilio mentioned a host of other sponsors and co-sponsors and supporters of this event, this conversation. Any one of them, I think, would welcome your effort, work, assistance to drive that mission home. I also want you to engage in some radical imagination. Think about the way in which the criminal legal system operates right now. What are the things that you are seeing? Are you close to someone who's been impacted by the criminal legal system? I guarantee you by virtue of your statistics, you probably are. Are you talking to that person about the challenges that they had to grapple with? Are you interacting with policymakers, with media, with experts about what you're seeing in the world and what you've learned? None of this stuff is easy. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We are on the heels of and engaged in a consistent revolution on racial justice. We live in a society that's ordered around a hierarchy that's driven by a vicious feedback loop of racialized history and policies and practices that produce inequitable outcomes and feed us stereotypes and myths about who we are and what our race and identity makes us. The work that we have to undertake demands that we break that cycle. I want you to see yourself as a foot soldier in the battle to break free of those very same patterns. You yourselves are the latest in a long line of people who have fought to complete the unfinished work of emancipation and the civil rights movement. And what you do today will have reverberations for decades, not only for you and your individual families and your loved ones and your communities, but for the nation as a whole. If people could run away for their freedom, if they could be beaten within inches of their lives for justice, if they could walk across a bridge just to vote, then you can call out people when they're engaged in racist behavior, when they're perpetuating the type of inequity and injustice that has been so endemic to this country. You can approach the world around you with a commitment to pursue anti-racism. And again, this is not easy work. Because if you do it correctly, the work is going to feel personal. Fundamentally, it is. And as it feels more personal, it gets messy and messier. You're going to have to think about your motivations for acting. You're going to want to avoid engaging in kind of performative allyship. This notion that it's not about you or about the optics or about getting defensive or even showing people that you are conscious or aware of what's happening in the world or about the benefits you might receive. It's ongoing work, and measuring success can be even harder. It's because it's not up to us to decide if you're anti-racist or to claim that label. The goal is to let your actions speak for you, to determine where you are at any given moment. You can behave in anti-racist ways. You can be thoughtful. You can do less harm. You can learn from your mistakes. You can take risks to hold other people and institutions and systems accountable and hold yourself accountable too. At the end of the day, it's about committing to using your own privilege and your own power to help those without it, those who've been the most harmed by the systems and institutions and ideologies that cast a shadow over the lives that we live. And it's about being willing to do it even when no one has eyes on you and no one will ever find out about it. And what I want to suggest to you is that as you engage in this work and continue to engage in this work, it becomes easier and easier. But the goal is to educate yourself by confronting our past, to get uncomfortable in cleaning up our own house, to roll up your sleeves and jump into the work, and to be conscious of your identity and privilege and motivation to act, to be thoughtful and strategic about how you choose to act. Ultimately, the work that you all have to engage in is about dismantling systems of oppression. It's about putting into practice the type of anti-racist policies that are driven by a vision for liberation of people. It's about changing culture. And it's also about being hopeful. My colleague, Brian Stevenson, who is a human rights lawyer, racial justice lawyer, the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, talks about this notion of hope. He said that hope is the enemy of injustice. Martin Luther King told us that we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. Hope is an orientation of the spirit. I'm not a religious person at all, but there's a Unitarian minister named Victoria Safford who talks about hope as a sometimes lonely place, a place of truth-telling about your own soul, first of all, and its condition, a place of resistance and defiance, the piece of ground from which you see the world both as it is and as it could be, as it will be, the place from which you glimpse not only struggle, but the joy of the struggle. If you've been listening at all, it should come as no surprise that we have a tremendous amount of work to do. And I'm so incredibly grateful to be in this struggle with all of you. I can't wait to see and continue to see all the work that this group and so many others like it do, and see what the future holds for us. And I'm always here as a partner in that effort to advance justice in any way that I can. I'd love now, I guess, to turn the floor over to Emilio to maybe curate some questions, and would like to see kind of more of a conversation than anything else. So with that, let's get into it.
Thank you so much for an incredibly meaningful and serious presentation. I'm sure, speaking on behalf of everybody, I learned a lot, and it's depressing, but there's also an incredible amount of questions here of folks wanting to learn how they can do more, offering up personal examples of things that they've seen that underscore what you're pointing out, and I'd like to start from the top a bit. First question I have to share comes from viewer Eric, who asks about your time as a public defender, the most marginalized members of the justice system. Was it rewarding defending them? Also, was it worth your efforts? And could you recommend specific systemic changes that might improve the standing of the individuals that you defended and how we might be able to influence work that people do within the justice system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it was incredibly rewarding working as a public defender and defending people who were in harm's way, who had been trapped and targeted for punishment and pain by the criminal legal system. And the fact of the matter is that the work that I did as a public defender and continue to do in defending people right through to today, so much of that work is about helping others who are going to be sitting in judgment of your client understand and treat them with dignity and respect and extend empathy to them, and understand kind of the context within which they're brought into the criminal legal system, understand that all these other institutions and systems have failed them throughout their lives, over the course of their lives, that drove them into the criminal legal system in the first place. And so to me, some of the most rewarding work was being kind of one of the only voices in the courtroom, or the only voice in the courtroom, who was standing up against a system that was designed specifically to destroy their lives and to destroy those individuals. And when I think about kind of what we need to do in order to address the way that system operates, I don't think the criminal system is broken. I think it's the most efficient, most effective, one of the most efficient and most effective systems that has ever been built, if the goal was to perpetuate a racial caste system in this country. I think the work that we need to do is start finding ways to shrink and reduce the size of the criminal legal system and shrink and reduce the influence of the system in people's lives. What does that mean? That means advocating for things like parole reform, to try and get people out of prisons who have been serving excessively and incredibly long sentences. That means advocating for sentencing reform, to shift downward the length of time that people are subjected to potential imprisonment for. That means choosing elected officials and district attorneys where that's an elected office, who are going to engage in policies that actually reduce and shrink the footprint of the criminal legal system in people's lives. That means beyond kind of those concerns around repair of or addressing the challenges of the criminal legal system, it also means shifting our priorities and making investments in people and in communities. The reality is that when you're denied education, denied employment, denied health, denied a political voice, denied healthy environment, all those things are things that are going to drive you into the criminal legal system. It's just a natural consequence of poverty, of inequality, of divestment, purposeful divestment for generations. And so what we need to do is, if we believe in the value of our political voice, and we believe that elected officials and elected leaders have a role to play in the types of investments that are made in our communities, we need to be politically conscious and push them to make those investments. And to the extent that pushing is not enough and talking to them is not enough, we have to figure out what is it going to take that's going to make it in their interest to do what we need them to do, right? How do we force them to do something that they might not initially see as in their interest? Because the reality is, it is in their interest. It's in all of our interest to have a society where people are able to live and thrive freely, right? And so I think part of the challenge is dismantling the system, and the other part of it is forcing people to make the types of investments in communities that have been for so long lacking, and have really been the root cause of so much of kind of the other end of the criminal legal system.
Good points. And you brought up a number of issues just in that answer. I mean, the fact that we have so many uncontested district attorney races here, there's never a challenge to that. There are other groups in the city that could help, even just getting indigency hearings for folks that have been ticketed, as well as work and reform with us, Legal Aid Society, Alma Center, other groups. A lot of what you brought up in the in the historic background for this is being loosely blanketed now in this culture war using the dog whistle critical race theory. And it's as though there's this effort to once again intentionally hide the history of the United States, the bloody and racist history of the United States, in an effort to perpetuate the systemic racism that's going on. And a bunch of the questions from some of the viewers here get to that, which are, what are ways we can push back against this this rallying cry to hide our racist history?
So, I think the challenge and task that we have is to continue to speak the truth. What is happening? Like, America is, I think, the world leader in gaslighting, right? What we're seeing in this kind of turn to vilify critical race theory and vilify things like the 1619 Project and vilify things that really mine our country's history is exactly what you would expect from a group of people who want to maintain power, who want to maintain dominance, who want to cover themselves in the myths and lies that we tell ourselves about the way this country is operated. What critical race theory actually does is it's an exploration of our country's history, of the underpinnings of our nation's history. We live in a country where we literally have a criminal legal system that, of course, rooted in the law, handed down by judges, by legislators, by elected officials, that literally defined race and defined it along the lines of who is free and who would be enslaved. That's baked into the origins of our country. Written into the Constitution, a 3/5 clause that we treat Black people, as less than a full human being. I mean, so critical race theory really is an examination of the ways in which the racism that's deeply woven into the fabric of our nation shapes not only our experiences and institutions, but also shapes the law and is perpetuated by the law. And it's an inquiry about the relationship between race, law, and power. And there's nothing controversial about understanding that our history shapes our present and shapes our future. And that's essentially what critical race theory is doing. It's a lens, it's a way of seeing the world. And it's a way of seeing the ways in which racial injustice shapes everything that we're seeing and experiencing today. It helps explain why you can have people storm the United States Capitol and be treated as though, or be spoke about as though they're just going on a tour of the Capitol, when in fact they're waving flags of white supremacy, engaging in this kind of mythology and lies around an election they say and claim is stolen in the face of no evidence at all that's true. All rooted in this desire to maintain and hold on to white privilege, white supremacy, and white power. And that's the type of focus that, if you look at the world with a critical race theory lens, that all makes sense because it's consistent with what we've seen throughout history, right? We saw it after the Civil War when the South, just a few years after the Civil War ended, and really right in the midst of it ending, operated on this notion that the people who were fighting for enslavement, fighting on the side of the South, were somehow noble, were somehow doing justice, were somehow not engaged in or advocating for holding people in bondage and treating them as property. A century later, we erect statues to these same people who were rebelling against the United States in order to hold people in bondage and in captivity. If you look at history with a racial justice lens, with a critical race theory lens, you see that truth for what it is. And I think we have to kind of keep on speaking that truth. We have to push back against it, fight back against it, because I don't know any other way to move forward.
Good observations. And before, many people watching are also asking for specific suggestions in how they can disrupt the racist criminal legal system and do some things. But before we get to that, I have also an additional history question from Lynette, asking specifically about your views on the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, saying that many folks would argue that the implementation of a federal separate but equal mandate caused substantial racial abuse against the Black community. We're hoping to hear some of your thoughts about that before we jump into present day again.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this Plessy versus Ferguson, the fundamental reality is, and this for folks who are not familiar with Plessy versus Ferguson, what that case said in the late 1890, 1896, as the attendee pointed out, essentially said that separate facilities are equal. And so segregation was legal and essentially countenanced the entire regime that emerged after emancipation and during Reconstruction. And I think that mandate, particularly coming from the United States Supreme Court, which is kind of the highest arbiter of law in the land, was consistent with the same ideology that really was baked into the foundation of our country. This notion that you could create separate facilities for individuals, and as long as you created separate facilities for individuals, those separate facilities are fine based along racial lines. This idea of separation of races in that way is based on this notion that if you are a person of color, if you're Black, if you're Latino, you don't deserve to be in the same physical space as someone who is white, because you are less than human. Your life does not actually matter. That mentality, that ideology, that casts a shadow over an entire generation of people. And it took 70 years almost for the Supreme Court to remedy and rectify that decision. But all the while, segregation was completely and openly legal, was a law of the day, was a policy of the day. And, the Supreme Court in Brown, which eventually was the case that talked about separate facilities being inherently unequal, shifted that paradigm and shifted that dynamic and led to kind of equal justice under law. But the implementation of Brown still remains outstanding today. There was an immediate backlash to it. There was an immediate pushback. Southern states engaged in this massive resistance. I'm reminded of cities and counties that, rather than integrate their schools, shut the entire school system down and opened up these private academies to maintain a system of segregation, to maintain a system of racial dominance and racial separation. Places where you would drain the entire pool rather than let Black and white children swim together. And so that kind of separate but equal notion harkens right back to the kind of very core inequities that have so broken and damaged this country from its birth.
Good observations. And it also brings me to, and this is a complicated question, because you have people Well, also, I'd like to back up and offer another list of criminal legal system reforms here as posited by the Wisconsin Justice Initiative. The link was posted by attorney Deja Vishny, and I have an announcement about attorney Motley and attorney Vishny later, but please take a look at that. Wisconsin Justice Initiative is another partner for this conversation. They've gone through doing a bunch of the homework for us, which brings me to the question. So, directly, what can we do to dismantle and break this apart? And also connected to this, how can we maintain hope in the face of this? A lot of people say, oh, this is just another bubble of, the same people doing these same things and fighting. How do we expand this message and how do we expand our impact? So if we have, police violence and racism, if we have institutions continually in a modern way supporting slavery and racism the same way that New York and other liberal northern institutions did during the Civil War, how do we divest our funds? How do we take action against these places so that they take note that we demand change?
Yeah, so I think part of what we saw happening last summer, and the work that we saw as a result of that is part of the answer, right? And what I saw last summer was an effort to raise our collective consciousness around race and racism in this country. I'm a big believer in the idea that law and culture are deeply intertwined and deeply related. And I often think that it's actually the fact that law follows culture and rather than the other way around. What that means is that we have to, when you press and push enough and change the cultural discourse, it's at that point that the law will adjust and that lawmakers, whether it be judges or politicians, will make decisions that are aligned with the cultural moment that we're in, right? And so I think that as a kind of first step, the way that we kind of engage that type of change and see that type of change is pushing around cultural norms and cultural narratives and changing that narrative. Part of what we have right now is a situation where we have ignored our America's history, right? We have completely glossed over the fact that you have people living in conditions right now that are a direct result of centuries of racism, of centuries of divestment, of intergenerational trauma and harm. And we as a country are content to just ignore that history completely. And I'm a big believer in the idea that we have to keep on reminding people of that history. That we can never stay silent, that we can never let that go. We can't think that history is, even though it's past, it's like William Faulkner said, it's not even, the history is never not dead, it's not even past yet, right? Or the past is never dead, it's not even past. We have to keep on reminding people of the way that history shapes the way our lives look right now. So I think that's part of it, right? I think we also have to, as we're engaging in this kind of imagination of what the world should look like, we need to come up with alternatives to the systems that we have in place right now, right? And so while I'm all for abolishing the way the criminal legal system operates, abolition is a practice, right? What that means is that you do more than just dismantle the criminal legal system. What are the types of systems that you want to put in place? How would you engage with an individual who would otherwise be caught up by the police or caught up by prisons or jails, right? What are the types of things that you would want to implement or invest in their lives or in their communities that would help avoid them having that situation? What are alternatives to holding people accountable? What are alternatives to police? What are alternatives to the types of systems that we have right now, right? And so I think part of it is grappling with and addressing that and thinking through what those systems look like, and take lessons from other countries, take lessons from other communities, take lessons from your own home, take lessons from our past, But I think it really does require us kind of advancing and putting forward a vision of what, or a different system or a different set of systems would look like. And I say a different set of systems because I think we've been so engaged and so enthralled and so mired in the criminal legal system that we have, that we think we have to have a one-to-one replacement. And the reality is that the criminal system is so massive, you're not going to have a one-to-one replacement. You need to replace it with a host of things. So that might mean that rather than send someone to prison, you decide to develop a restorative justice program with a local public defender's office and a prosecutor's office, and track cases through that type of a system. That might mean that instead of sending someone to prison for decades, you cut their sentence or let them live in the community and pay their dues in a different way. It really means, I think, expanding and opening up our imagination to what other things are out there that we might put in its place. I think that's often the refrain is, well, you want to eliminate the police or eliminate prisons or jails. What is going to replace that? And I think that's where we often get trapped or caught up, is the what next. And I think the other piece of it is we have to understand that it's going to be an iterative process. So that means that not everything's going to work perfectly or exactly as planned when you implement it. But that shouldn't stop us from trying, from attempting different ways of holding people to account, ensuring that they're going to be able to live law-abiding, positive, and productive lives. And again, it kind of gets back to this investments piece of really engaging with, part of it is about desegregation and ending the physical barriers that divide us, and making investments in communities that have been so under-resourced and divested from for generations.
And forgive me, I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm taking notes as you're speaking. One, thank you again for coming here. And two, we had spent in February, we did 4 separate talks, not the least of which was with Danielle Sered, just on restorative justice and what that looks like in the infrastructure here in the state and city. I found your phrase earlier. I wrote down here, you think of yourselves as architects of democracy. And I really feel like that kind of created an umbrella for what you were just saying about how we have to go through ourselves this iterative process of reinvesting, of reimagining what these alternatives look like, whether it's with our own Milwaukee's Office of Violence Prevention, Violence Disruptors, creating restorative justice, working to try to empty places like the House of Correction, people on the side. There's are as many comments and observations as there are questions about what's overtaxed in our system, how these nonprofits, state public defenders, and other folks are burdened under this incredible beast that's the criminal legal system. So thank you for some of these suggestions. Yeah. I want to pause too on this. I think we could continue talking with you for hours, and I know that you have another engagement after this. And I just wanted to take the time to thank you again on behalf of everybody that has attended here, and we'll edit this and share this both on Facebook and our YouTube channels. It was a real pleasure, Vincent. I also want to thank Rebecca and Robin and Karen from Tosa Talks, who originally met with you and introduced us so that we could have you here sharing this with us. There's just a terrible ongoing problem, not only in Milwaukee, not only in Wisconsin, but in the country. And there are a lot of other questions here we'll share later, and I'll share them with you. I also want to draw attention to the fact that a lot of us will be watching something you referred to also, which was the horrible murder of Jay Anderson at the hands of former Wauwatosa officer Joseph Mensah. And Judge Yamahiro's date to talk about that has changed. So folks that are following that, I've posted the new date and the list and the link to the court system there, so you can see that attorneys Kimberly Motley and Deja Vishny will be there July 28th at 10 a.m. So if you're interested, please go to the Tosa courthouse, follow along. I put a link there. Show up to support Jay and his family. Show up to support the incredible work of Attorney Motley and others. Attorney Motley, who spoke on this not that long ago too. And I encourage you all to stay involved. If you enjoyed this, if you want to see more, we're going to have other conversations in the not too distant future about our election system. A lot of people are crying, oh, boo-hoo, magically, although there's no evidence our election somehow got robbed, and Trump should be president forever. We'll be refuting that with Ann Jacobs, Anita Johnson, and hopefully the city attorney from Green Bay and others in the near future. If you have any questions, please contact me on the side. We hope that you'll remember to get involved with some of the groups that Executive Director Southerland mentioned, take part of some of the actions there. We will go over, people asked for some of the books that you recommended. I'll listen through this and I'll post that in a follow-up email. Thank you for those recommendations. I'll share the chat from those of you suggesting other things. And I'd like to once again thank not only our friends at Tosa Talks and the other Milwaukee Turners, and invite you to become a member of either of those two groups, but thank Bostic Smart Adhesives, Bay Bridge, Bridge the Divide, Milwaukee Inner City Congregations Allied for Hope, Milwaukee School of Engineering Scholars and Honors Program, Milwaukee Turners Confronting Mass Incarceration, Marquette University Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach, the National Lawyers Guild of Milwaukee, Rid Racism Milwaukee, Underwood Church, Wisconsin Decarceration Platform, and our friends at Wisconsin Justice Initiative. Thank you so much for coming here. And, until the next time, please take care of one another, friends. It's very important that we do this. I think that our society is determined by us. And although its foundation is written in bloodshed, where we go next, if we adopt Vincent's phrase, hopefully we'll be the architects of democracy. Thank you again so much, Vincent. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Really, really appreciate it and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks. All right, friends, take care of each other. Bye-bye. Oh, and Vincent, you're the host now. You get to close us out. I no longer have the magic power.
So I just hit end, I guess, right?
You hit end, my friend.
All right, take care.